So let's recall our motivation. And to make sure that what we do is something valuable, let's make sure our motivation is far-reaching and not just concerned with the happiness of this life, and not just kind of no motivation at all because I have nothing better to do, but really remembering our fortune to be able to hear and contemplate and meditate on the teachings. Wanting to do this to better our own mind and to be of the long-term benefit for each and every living being, specifically by benefiting them in spiritual ways as well as in temporal ways. Let's go back to that paragraph, the bottom of page 43, where we stopped this morning. You have to put together that if objects really did exist in the way they seem to, the logical consequences would be impossible. And on this basis, you can fully appreciate that phenomena do not exist this way. Okay, so this is how you use reasoning to understand reality. That the things appear to us to be existing out there in and of themselves from their own side, independent of everything else. Okay, and then if things really did exist this way, then there should be certain things that happened and certain things that didn't happen. Okay? So, for example, if things existed with their own essence independent of causes and conditions or anything else, then they should be unchanging. Okay? Because something that isn't affected by causes and conditions is unchanging. Yeah, it's permanent in the sense of momentarily it doesn't arise and disintegrate. It's just fixed. Okay? So if things were independent like that, then they should be permanent. Okay? So, things look like this is always a book. This has the nature of the book. It's out there, indivisible, a book from its own side. Now, if the book existed as a book from its own side, then it shouldn't depend on causes to arise. It should be unchanging. And it should never disintegrate and become something else. Is that the case? No. Okay. So here we see that there's some disparity between the way things appear to us and the way they must actually exist. Okay? So think of a time when you've been really mad at somebody. Okay? Really, you just don't like this person. Does the way you think of this person, do they seem like they're just there, inherently screwed up through and through, with no chance of ever changing? Mm-hmm. Do they seem that way to you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. They are just inherently like that. I mean, just they're hopeless. Hopeless. This guy's a jerk. You can't communicate with him. He doesn't listen to anybody. He's been this way his whole life. This is just who he is, through and through. Every single moment of his life, this is the way he is. Right? This is the way the person appears to us. Okay. Now, if that appearance were true, if he really did exist like that, then he could never have any other mental states besides that one. Yeah. Now, is that the case? No. Because this person has many different mental states. No, they have an eye consciousness that sees red. And they, have a taste consciousness that tastes cookies. And they like different things, and they have many different thoughts. But all of that would be totally impossible if they existed from their own side with this inherently defective personality that is beyond all hope. Okay? So when we see that, then we see that the way we are holding on to this person, there's something wrong with it. The way we're conceiving of this person is there's really something wrong. They can't exist that way. Yeah. Because also, if they were there independent of any factors, then it would mean that when they were born that particular age with that kind of body. Because they wouldn't have been born as a baby and had to grow, because that involves change. So they would have been born, 56 years old and scowling. Coming out of their mother's womb. Oh my goodness. That's a difficult birth. Yeah. Yeah. But that's the way it would have to be if they didn't, if they were that way independent of all other factors. And if they were totally hopeless. Okay? So we use reasoning to kind of ask ourselves, if things were like this, then, certain things should happen, but certain things don't happen. Yeah? So something's wrong with the way I'm apprehending things. Mm-hmm. Or take something that you really like. Okay. Chocolate cake. For the sake, your chocolate cake could be anything. It could be your ancient antique lantern. It could be, we all have our own variety of something that we consider wonderful. Okay. So your ancient antique lantern, something that I would throw away, you think is like wonderful. And my chocolate cake, which, you think forget it, too sweet, too fattening, I think is wonderful. And, all these different things, whatever it is, the thing that you're attached to. Okay. So when you look at your chocolate cake, it looks like one thing, doesn't it? There it is. One thing. One chocolate cake. One whole. It's a whole. It's one thing. Okay? And that's how it appears to us, as one thing. So it looks like it's one whole, indivisible thing. Okay? Independent of other factors. Now, if that were the case, then you shouldn't be able to cut it into different pieces. Because different pieces makes it many things. So is it one thing or is it many things? Yeah. Is it one chocolate cake or is it many chocolate cakes? If you say, well, no, it's just pieces of chocolate cake, then when you put pieces together, how do you get, if those pieces are inherently existent, how come a collection of pieces becomes a whole chocolate cake? We still have this problem. Is it one thing or is it many things? When you put the pieces together, is it one or is it many? Because something can't be both one and many at the same time, can it? It's either one thing or it's more than one. Okay. So, when we look at that cake and it's just one thing, then we should never be able to cut it up into different pieces. Yeah, it would grow stale sitting there, because cutting it would make it into many things, would make it into pieces. You would no longer have a chocolate cake. You would just have pieces. Okay? So there's all these kinds of arguments that when you go into the text that they present that make us see that our way of apprehending things is somehow distorted. Yeah. So, think of that thing that you really cherish, and then imagine it breaking apart into pieces. There's your antique lantern in many pieces. Now what? Now your mind freaks out. It's broken. It's not supposed to break because it's one thing. And this is why we freak out when things we're attached to break, because they're not supposed to, because our mind thinks they're one thing, inherently from their own side. Yeah. So it's quite interesting. You see, to take something, that brand new candy apple red sports car, and you break it into pieces. 4 wheels and an engine, and I don't even know all the parts of the car. I learned in high school, but wasn't my thing. You have this piston somewhere and spark plug somewhere and an axle and a hood and all these things. Is it the same? Do you have that same feeling when it's all broken down into individual pieces? Yeah? If you went to the showroom floor and there it was in pieces, would you say, I want to buy this car? But you see, if it existed as one concrete thing, the way it appears to us, then it shouldn't be made of pieces like this. And you should never be able to take it apart. Mm-hmm. Or if you did take it apart, you should have the same feeling for it when it was all different pieces than when it was assembled as a car. Or you should have the same feeling for it when all the pieces were assembled in a different way. Which sometimes happens, doesn't it? Yeah. But that's not the way it is. So something's wrong with the way it's appearing and the way we're grasping it. Okay, so that's what His Holiness is referring to in that sentence. Okay, so you fully appreciate that phenomena do not exist in this way. People and things may still seem to exist concretely and independently from their own side. Okay, so after you have this realization that, there's some disparity between appearance and existence, and you begin to see that things don't exist in the way they appear, that they're empty of inherent existence, you may still have, in the break time between meditation sessions, things may still appear to independent and concrete. Yeah, but you're aware that they don't really exist in the way they appear. Okay, it's like it's like a politician. When the politician speaks, there's recently this morning an article in the New York Times about all these politicians who who voted against the, having background checks for guns, and they got so much flack from their constituencies that now they're saying, well, really, I'm for gun regulation, and I voted for this and that measure that has a beautiful title, but actually, a beautiful title that sounds like it was for gun regulation, but actually wasn't. Okay, so here you have these people who are trying to appear one way, but you've had, as doing exactly what you want them to do, no matter that the constituents want them to do different things, because they want to, they have to look like they're working for everybody to get everybody's votes. Okay, so they appear to be saying one thing and doing one thing, but you've had enough experience with them that you know that it's a bunch of and so you don't trust the appearances. They still appear that way, honest, upright, but your mind says, you're not fooling me. Okay, so it's the same way. Things still appear to be out there, existing from their own side, but in our mind, after we've realized emptiness, we know that that's a false appearance. We're not going to be deceived by it. Okay? Gradually, this awareness will weaken your misconceptions and diminish the trouble they cause. Since accepting appearances as truth is the basic problem, the antidote is to come to realize the falsity of appearances through reasoning. Okay, so understanding that the way things appear is false, and we understand that through asking ourselves questions. If they existed in this way, could this and that happen? Yeah. If this politician were upright and undeceptive, could they have said this and done that? Yeah. So it's the same way, we question. If things really exist as one whole concrete object, then why do they break apart into different pieces? And why do I have a different feeling about the pieces than I do about the whole? Okay, so that's how you use reasoning to go beyond the appearance. Okay, if this person, really were inherently, obnoxious, then how is it that they just smiled? Could that happen? Yeah. How is it that they just opened the car door for me? Or how is it that they greeted me when I came to work if they're 100% obnoxious? Okay? So something's wrong with the appearance and how we grasp the appearance. So the next section says 3 ways of seeing objects. There are 3 modes of mental operation on an object. That means 3 ways of seeing something. So here Jeffrey uses the word conceiving. I prefer to use the word apprehending or grasping. It's just different ways to translate the same Tibetan word. The reason why I don't like the word conceiving is because having conception seems very gross, doesn't it? Whereas this process of how we're apprehending or grasping something is not that gross. Yeah, we just do it automatically. Okay, so the first of the 3 ways, grasping the object to inherently exist, which is what ignorance does. So ignorance grasps things, this is one way to apprehend things, grasp them as having their own essence out there, their own identity, independent of everything else. Second way is apprehending the object to not inherently exist, which is what insight does. So what insight or what wisdom does is sees that things do not inherently exist, that they're empty of inherent existence. And then 3, apprehending the object without qualifying it either as inherently existent or empty of inherent existence. Okay? Just as when you ordinarily see something, such as a house. Okay? So we aren't always apprehending or grasping things as true existent. Yeah, often we just look at things and say, this is a clock, and that's a book, and that's a cup. And at that point, we aren't grasping the thing to exist inherently. It still appears inherently to us, but we aren't grasping it in that way. So that's the third way of apprehending things. Sometimes, like we can have it. This is a cup, yeah. So I'm not grasping it as truly existent. It's the third way of apprehending it. But if somebody comes here and takes it, what are you taking my cup? This is my cup. Bring it back. I want to drink something. That's not your cup. It's my cup. At that point, I'm apprehending the cup as inherently existent. I'm assenting to that appearance of inherent existence. Okay? So it's subtle, We do it all the time, but we have to learn to identify how something appears when that grasping is actually going on. Like when you just look at it and say it's a cup, versus when your ownership of it is threatened, how you look at it. Okay? Or take somebody you're very attached to. How do you apprehend that person when you first wake up in the morning? Oh, there's my kid, there's my mother, there's my father, there's my spouse. It's just like that, no big deal. But when you think of that person leaving you or dying, whoa, it's like they suddenly appear to be this real concrete person. And, we don't want to separate from them. Then they're real and solid and concrete, and it's going to cause us so much suffering if we're separated from them. So the way we're apprehending them when we're threatened with loss triggers our attachment, and so we apprehend them as truly existent or inherently existent at that time. Okay? So it's quite interesting to watch your mind, and watch how your mind relates to an object when it's just, oh, that's there, versus when your relationship with it changes. Yeah, and how you perceive it. Huh? Okay. So even when you are not seeing an object as inherently existent, the way ignorance does, you are not necessarily seeing it as not inherently existent, the way insight does. Okay? Since there are thoughts that do neither, which fall into the third category. Okay? So just because you're not grasping an inherent existence doesn't realize that you're apprehending emptiness. Okay? This is why you need to delineate specifically those phenomena about which you are making this fundamental mistake. Just thinking about something else will not reverse ignorance. So he's going back to that again. That tree in the backyard isn't going to stop anything. It should be like searching for a robber in town, or it would be like searching for a robber in town after the robber has gone to the forest. Okay? Doesn't do any good. When ignorance is overcome, you will have uprooted the mistaken beliefs that superimpose on objects qualities such as beauty and ugliness beyond what they actually have. Okay? And that's what attachment does. It superimposes, beauty or desirability onto someone or something beyond what is really there. Okay? Kind of like when you fall in love with somebody and that person just looks like, they're 100% perfect. Wow, this is fantastic. Yeah. So, but if they really existed that way, because we've exaggerated their perfection and created them as, this big thing and then gotten attached. If they really existed that way, everybody else would see them as wonderful and perfect, just like we do. But the person, we think is terrific, somebody else can't stand. It's true, isn't it? Yeah? So how could that be if we were apprehending them right? And similarly, the person that we think is just, beyond civilization, somebody else thinks is fantastic. Yeah. It's like Adolf Hitler is made into this, monster. Everybody sees him, But when you say the name Adolf Hitler, one image comes to your mind. Yeah. But his family loved him. And he was kind to his family. Yeah. And we go, wait a minute, no, that's not possible. He must have sent his family to the gas chambers too. Mm-hmm. No, but he didn't. Okay? So there we can see that we were exaggerating the negativity beyond what it is. Yeah. Of course we're not condoning what he did, but we're also realizing that he isn't 100% those actions. Okay? Then all the other afflictive emotions, attachment, hatred, jealousy, belligerence, and so on, that have ignorance as their root, are overcome. So when we see that we exaggerate things by superimposing inherent existence and inherently existent attractiveness and beauty or ugliness or whatever it is, when we're able to take that away, then and the ignorance is gone, then the other afflictive emotions that plague our mind also crumble, because they all depend on ignorance. Okay? When afflictive emotions are removed, they can no longer motivate your actions. So that means we no longer create karma under the influence of those afflictive emotions. Then your powerless birth and rebirth in cyclic existence, driven by predispositions established by your actions, which is the other aspect of karma, this is also overcome and liberation is attained. Okay, so here he's going through. Before we talked about the evolution of cyclic existence. Ignorance gives rise to afflictive emotions, which give rise to polluted actions, which give rise to rebirth in the cycle of existence, plagued by aging, sickness, and death, and everything that happens in between. Now he's saying, when you remove ignorance, then you stop the afflictive emotions, then you stop creating the karma, that produces the rebirths in cyclic existence, and then all those undesirable effects, of taking a body which is by nature going to get old and sick and die. All of that stops. So he's showing how we get out of samsara there. You need to contemplate this progression so that it is clear to you, and then unerringly seek the truth. When you fully understand how you enter into and disengage from the round of suffering, in other words, from samsara, you will appreciate and value knowing the way persons and things actually are. Okay, so when you are on your way to getting out of prison, and you've gotten out of prison, then you really appreciate the fact that you've been able to correct your wrong views and get out. If you do not come to understand that ruinous attitudes can be extinguished, the existence of liberation will not be clear to you. But when you understand that mistaken perspectives can indeed be removed, your intention to achieve liberation will strengthen. This is why insight is so important. Okay? So he's really saying that we need to understand how we get into samsara and how we get out. And when we really understand the role that ignorance plays, then we'll have a lot of energy to realize things as they actually are in order to free ourselves from this whole round. So then there's some meditative reflections. So you can do this in your next meditation. He suggests, consider this. 1, ignorance leads to exaggerating the importance of beauty, ugliness, and other qualities. So think about that in your meditation. 2, exaggeration of these qualities leads to attachment, hatred, jealousy, belligerence, and so on. So make some examples in your life. 3, these destructive emotions lead to actions contaminated by misperception. So think of what you do when you're angry and belligerent and rebellious and greedy. Yeah? And 4, these actions, or karma, lead to powerless birth and rebirth in cyclic existence and repeated entanglements and trouble. So think about how our actions bring those kind of results that we ourselves experience. 5, removing ignorance undermines our exaggeration of positive and negative qualities. This undercuts attachment, hatred, jealousy, belligerence, and so on, putting an end to the actions contaminated by misperception, thereby ceasing powerless birth and rebirth in cyclic existence. So this is how we get out, what I was just saying. And then 6, insight is the way out. And so we, at that point, really feel like, wow, I want to understand the nature of reality so that I can get out of this mess. Okay, now we're at part 2, which is called How to Undermine Ignorance. So chapter 4 is the feeling the impact of interrelatedness. Yeah. So he starts with the Tibetan saying, a 6-inch line is short relative to an 8-inch line. An 8-inch line is short relative to a 10-inch line. Obvious, isn't it? But what it's showing is how long and short depend on each other. They don't exist in and of themselves. Okay? Sometimes we say, I'm a short person. Yeah, or I'm a tall person, or whatever it is. But we're only short or tall in relationship to other people. Just by ourselves, we're not short or tall. Yeah. It's like sometimes when you see a picture of somebody, and it's just a blank background, you have no idea how tall they are. Yeah? And you're trying to get a sense of this person, but you can't figure out how tall they are. Yeah? Because you have to they become tall or short in relation to someone else or something else. If the mistaken view that people and things exist independently is the cause of all other counterproductive views and emotions, then one of the principal means of overcoming this mistaken outlook is to reflect on the fact that all phenomena exist dependently. Okay? So if ignorance, that is grasping at things as existing independent of other factors, is incorrect, then the opposite of that, how things really exist, must be that they exist dependent on other factors. Okay? Because things can either be dependent or independent. They can't be both. Yeah, and they can't be neither either, can they? Yeah, something is either dependent on other things or it exists totally autonomously, separate from anything else. Okay? As Nagarjuna's precious garland of advice says, when there is long, there has to be short. They do not exist through their own nature. So Republicans and Democrats depend on each other. Yeah, you can't have Republicans unless you have Democrats. You can't have Democrats unless you have Republicans. Okay? So all these things are dependent on each other. They don't exist as self-enclosed, isolated entities. Yeah. This relativity is why Buddhists say that all phenomena are dependent arisings rather than independent arisings. Through reflecting on dependent arising, you will lose the belief that things exist in and of themselves. Nagarjuna says, the apprehension of inherent existence is the cause of all unhealthy views. Afflictive emotions are not produced without this error. Therefore, when emptiness is thoroughly known, unhealthy views and afflictive emotions are thoroughly pacified. Okay? So, the apprehension of inherent existence underlies all of our wrong views and afflictive emotions. And, wrong views and afflictive emotions are not produced without ignorance. Okay? So then, when we know emptiness, which is how things really exist, when that's known thoroughly, then wrong views and afflictive emotions are completely purified because that ignorance is removed by the wisdom. And another verse from Nagarjuna says, through what is emptiness known? Okay. It is known through seeing dependent arising. Buddha, the supreme knower of reality, said what is dependently produced is not inherently produced. In other words, what is dependently arising is not inherently arising. Okay, so this is the going into that things are either independent or they're dependent. They can't be both. Yeah. And so the Buddha said that whatever is produced or whatever arises in dependence on other factors can't exist independently. Okay? Nagarjuna's student Aryadeva similarly says that understanding dependent arising is crucial for overcoming ignorance. And Aryadeva's quote is, all afflictive emotions are overcome through overcoming ignorance. When dependent arising is seen, ignorance does not arise. Okay, so again, we're seeing dependent arising and emptiness. Dependent arising and inherent existence are completely the opposite. Because inherent existence means independent existence. So they're completely the opposite. So if we thoroughly understand dependent arising, then we also can't at the same time grasp inherent existence. Yeah. If you know that the politician is lying, at the same time, you're not going to see him as telling the truth. Okay? That's what it's getting down to. Am I cynical about politicians? Or can I just I can state a fact without being cynical, can't I? Okay. Dependent arising refers to the fact that all impermanent phenomena, whether physical, mental, or otherwise, come into existence dependent upon certain causes and conditions. Whatever arises dependent upon certain causes and conditions is not operating exclusively under its own power. Okay. So something that depends on causes and conditions is not operating under its own power. This, the text that we're doing Thursday night, the 400 stanzas by Aryadeva, we're doing this in preparation for Geshe Topke's course in July, which I really will encourage you to attend. It's going to be quite good. Anyway, we haven't gotten to the 4th chapter yet, but the 4th chapter is talking about how things lack an independent self. And it uses the example of a king or a leader, and how, we usually think of leaders as having so much power and being able to act independently. But Aryadeva says they only get their status because people give them that status. If people didn't give them that status, they wouldn't have that power, they wouldn't have that office, they wouldn't have that power, be able to do all those things. Yeah. So he goes into this whole explanation about how leaders are dependent on the people they lead. And so they should not be arrogant. There's no reason to be arrogant because you are not a leader or a ruler, from your own side. You're there completely independence upon other people. Yeah. So it's, the chapters to cut off arrogance. But it's true, isn't it? Any position we have only because other people acknowledge us as having that position. If nobody acknowledged us as having that position, we wouldn't have it. Yeah? So this can be a little bit jarring because we like to think of ourselves as, whatever career you have, I am a this. All by myself, I am a this. Yeah? Don't we? Yeah, whatever your career is, I am a this. Now, this is, inside out who I am. But actually, we're only whatever that career is because other people acknowledged us as having that. How do they acknowledge us? Well, maybe through the licensing procedure. Or maybe through vote, or maybe through, us convincing them to give us that name. It could be many different ways, but there's always some way in which our being, whatever it is dependent on other people giving us that name. Yeah, and seeing us in that way. It's not all by ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's what can be very interesting about coming to retreats and being silent in retreats, is nobody knows who you are and what you do as a living. Yeah? And do you sometimes feel a little bit uneasy? As soon as there's discussion groups, well, I got to tell people about my life and who I am. But to be able to come here and be in this group and nobody knows anything about you and nobody really cares. Nobody cares what you do for a living. Nobody cares how much money you have. Nobody cares what level of education you have. Yeah? Doesn't really matter when you come here. Yeah? So it's like, And then you see, I'm not that identity unless people see me that way. And here's a place where people don't see me that way. So how do I feel about that? It'd be nice to sometimes be able to come here in a different body and see how people relate to you then? Yeah? Wouldn't it be interesting to be able to come here and, come as somebody of the opposite sex? Or come as somebody from a different age group? Or to come as somebody from a different race or a different ethnicity? Yeah, or a different height or a different weight? And then, how would I feel being that person? How would my self-image change? Just through changing some kind of minor criteria, like that surrounding our body. Yeah, and then you see how, you only become something because, people relate to you in a certain way, or people have certain ideas about certain things. But aside from all this conceptuality, there's nothing inherent in us that is a certain thing. What is us that makes us American? Those of us who are American, or whatever nationality you are. What is it? What is it that makes you American?
Passport.
That's it, isn't it? Your passport. That's the only thing that makes you American. Is there something inside your body that makes you American? Yeah? Do you have an American liver? Yeah. I mean, whatever your nationality is, what is it that makes you that nationality? It's simply what piece of paper you show when you have to cross a border. That's the only thing. Yeah? Everything else. I mean, and you see how all this conceptuality, it's the whole thing of, nationality and different nations and things like that. It all depends on people, having concepts and giving names to different things. Huh? And what is it? 400 years, you couldn't even say I'm American. There was no idea. Even Native Americans couldn't say I'm American because there was no idea of American then. Yeah? It's quite interesting when you think of it. What we get really attached to, and it's just concepts and names that somehow people agree on. And when we don't agree, then we fight wars. Yeah? I mean, what a lot of wars and what a lot of court cases are about is what label are we going to give something? Okay? There's this piece of dirt. Okay? This piece of dirt. What are we going to call that dirt? Yeah? Are we going to call it India or are we going to call it Pakistan? What are we going to call that piece of dirt? Wow, let's fight about it. That's exactly what's going on in border disputes. Yeah, what are we going to call this piece of dirt? Yeah, a criminal trial. What label are we going to give to the action this person did? Are we going to give it the label of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter? Yeah, no case at all, dismissed case. What label are we going to give that action? And that's what the whole justice system is about. What label is it going to be? Yeah, you go to the doctor. Yeah, what we're looking for from the doctor is a label. Yeah, give me a label to these symptoms. That's the only thing a disease is a bunch of symptoms that we've given a label to. That's all a disease is. It's not like, cancer, heart disease, It's just certain symptoms, and then we give it that label. Yeah. And for all the psychological things, I mean, what is it? DSM-5. Now you're going to have a whole bunch of new labels, and so many more people. Yeah, I mean, forget your past, forget your previous psychological disease. You're going to get re-diagnosed with DSM-5, and how they treat you, and what medicine you get, and whether your insurance covers it. Is all going to change because the label's changed. It's true, isn't it? Yeah? But when we don't see that all these things are depending on concept and label, we think they're like really solid and concrete. Especially our psychological things. I mean, now, thanks to DSM-5, so many more people are going to have psychological disorders. It used to be that a kid was, kind of undisciplined. Now they have, what's the name of this disorder? Defiant disorder, Huh? It's like, I know one family where the mother's diagnosed everybody in the family with the disorder. Yeah? Including herself. but it's all names and labels. And then we get, and then I think that's so damaging, especially to kids, I got this label, I was diagnosed as, what was it, oppositional defiance disorder, ODD, odd. Oppositional defiance disorder. I was 3 years old. And I had oppositional defiance disorder. And this becomes this child's identity their whole life, And then they come to the Abbey and we ask, tell us about yourself. I have oppositional defiance disorder. And we go, ah. It's like, and as people assuming identities over all of this, like that. I was telling you the teenager this morning. I've been emotionally damaged. Yeah. Okay. So whatever arises dependent upon certain causes and conditions is not operating exclusively under its own power. So that's the point. That's the point. Yeah? So here's another meditative reflection. Bring to mind an impermanent phenomena such as a house. Okay? House. How about meditation hall? Impermanent phenomena. Oh God, I don't want to know about impermanence. That means it's going to fall apart and we're going to have to fix it again. Ah! How about a permanent meditation hall? Okay, we're going to go do the exercise. Bring to mind an impermanent phenomena like the meditation hall, okay? Consider its coming into being in dependence upon specific causes, lumber, carpenters, and so forth. Okay, so look around. We call meditation hall. And think of it before it was built and there were just a pile of logs and some sacks of concrete. Yeah. And the lamps were still somewhere else and the fan was still somewhere else and the green paint was in the pot. Yeah. So think of it like that. Yeah. See if this dependence conflicts with the houses or the buildings appearing as if it exists in its own right. Does it conflict? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Mm-hmm. If you think of this as something, just a bunch of different parts, that came together, does that conflict with how real it seems right now? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? You know, building a building is quite interesting because, yeah, that's Chenrezig Hall. But at what point did it become Chenrezig Hall? Yeah. When we just had the hole there last August, would you look and say there's Chenrezig Hall? No. When we poured the footings? No. Okay. When we started putting the first Foswell blocks around, one row of Foswell blocks, would you say that's Chenrezig Hall? No. Okay, what about when you had all the Foswell blocks of the first floor? Okay. No subfloor, no second story. Would that be Chenrezig Hall? At that point, would you look and say there's Chenrezig Hall?
Get closer.
Yeah. Yeah, some, you know,
Halfway there.
yeah, you would, when you think of what it's going to look like when it's done, then you would say, no, that's not Chenrezig Hall. But when you think of what it looked like when it was just the whole, oh yeah, Chenrezig Hall. Yeah, Chenrezig Hall is coming into existence. Now, how can you talk of Chenrezig Hall coming into existence? If Chenrezig Hall were inherently existent, it would be there already.
That's what we like.
Wouldn't it? Yes, make things so much easier. You know, because if you say the name Chenrezig Hall, you have an image of something that already exists. So if it were inherently existent and already existent, how could it arise? How could we build it? Yeah, if Chenrezig Hall was existent in this very moment, how could we build it? No need to build something that's already existent. If Chenrezig Hall doesn't exist at all, how could we build it? Yeah. So at what point does it become Chenrezig Hall? Yeah. When you get that subfloor on top of that, the first thing, is it Chenrezig Hall then? When you're out in the middle of the winter shoveling the snow off that subfloor day after day after day, do you say, here's Chenrezig Hall?
We did.
I don't know. We're saying, let's shovel the snow off Chenrezig Hall.
You might say, let's shovel the snow off Chenrezig Hall. But when you're thinking of Chenrezig Hall, next year when you say, I'm going to Chenrezig Hall, are you going to think of going to the subfloor?
Need all the colors picked out in the Chenrezig Hall?
Yeah, does it? Yeah, does it need the soffits?
It need a christening ceremony.
You're right.
Official decision, we're all now going to call it.
Chenrezig Hall, yeah.
So that was my thought. You could build this whole building, you know, and have it exactly the way done to the point where you would say, this is Chenrezig Hall, and then you sell this place and it becomes the wrong McDonald's house.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yep. Yeah, we've gone through this scene with the department that with the kind of hood we have to have in the kitchen because we're vegetarian. Yeah, so we convince them that we don't need the super expensive kind of complicated hood. But if we later sell it and it becomes a dude ranch and they serve meat, they're going to have to put in a new kind of hood in the kitchen. Okay? Because it will no longer be Chenrezig Hall. It'll be Chenrezig Dude. Hey, dude. Yeah, but you think of it, you know, at what point does it become Chenrezig Hall? what point does it become habitable? When we get occupancy? But we can get occupancy without the floor being in. Is it inhabitable without the floor? Well, it depends if it's raining or not. If it's raining, it sure is inhabitable. If it's not raining and you have an alternative place to stay, then it's not inhabitable. So something's not, something in it on its own, from its own side. It completely depends on other conditions. Huh? And then we're going to put a statue of Kuan Yin. When you first walk in, there's going to be a statue of Kuan Yin. And I'm sure somebody's going to come and say, this is called Chenrezig Hall. How come you have a statue of Kuan Yin? Yeah. And we say, well, Kuan Yin is the same as Chenrezig. And then somebody's going to say, but they look different. Yeah. Well, Chenrezig has different manifestations. Well, how do you know? And, can anything be a manifestation of Chenrezig? Can I call this Chenrezig? Yeah? So, it gets quite interesting when you think about it. Now, when does something become a certain thing? Okay. Maybe, do you have any questions? Yeah.
Nothing exists?
Nothing exists? You don't exist? I don't exist? Is that true? Do you exist? Does this room exist? Are you apprehending something? Are you experiencing something? What is your experience at this moment?
Well, from my experience, what I want to say is, yes, that inherent existence is not dependent upon independent arising, that something can, like if we all come in here and none of us have a sense of sight and we can't see each other, we only hear each other's sounds, or we only have a sense of smell, we only smell each other, or only touch each other. We have none of the other senses, only touching. Or if we have none of those, we can experience one another, we still exist. I would say yes, that they're not our labels or our perceptions, but there is something.
Yeah, things exist, but they don't exist independent of other things. Okay?
So there is inherent existence.
No, there's no inherent existence, but there's regular old existence. Okay? Inherent existence, independent existence, that doesn't exist anywhere. But plain old conventional existence does exist. Yeah, there's people in this meditation hall and there's a meditation hall. Okay? Is there an inherently existent meditation hall that doesn't depend on anything else, including our thinking, oh, it's a meditation hall? No, there's no inherently existent meditation hall. But is there a meditation hall that exists by all of us saying, oh, we're going to call that building meditation hall because we go in there and meditate? Yeah, that exists. Okay?
So what's the difference?
Well, the difference is that one exists independent of anything else, and the other one exists dependent on everything else. Okay? Because if this building were a meditation hall independent of everything else, then there would be no need for there to be people who came here to meditate. Horses could live in here, and somebody would walk up and say, here's the meditation hall. Because Because if it were a meditation hall from its own side, independent of anything, independent of what we used it for, then the horses could live here, the ants could live here. Don't even think that. The cows could live here, and it would still be a meditation hall. But that's not the case, is it? It's only a meditation hall because there's people who come in here to meditate. Okay? So something existing independent is different than something existing dependent. Things can't exist independent of anything else. They only exist dependent on other things. Okay? Yeah.
So then what would samsara's existence be dependent upon?
Well, you differentiate samsara because there's the liberation from samsara. There's nirvana. Okay? We can...
On ignorance, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And when you're talking about causal dependence, it depends on ignorance. When you're talking about relational dependence, then it would depend on nirvana. Okay? So many kinds of dependence. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit more about the three types of apprehension, apprehending things as inherently existing, apprehending them as not inherently existing, just apprehending them. Is that related to your response to them?
Okay, so the three kinds of ways of apprehending something are our responses to things related to those three. Okay? So, if I saw somebody and I said, this guy is just too much, you know? Let's take somebody, Joseph Stalin, okay? Inherently evil, no redeeming qualities, murdered 20 million people. I mean, he was incredible how many people died under his reign. Yeah. And you're apprehending him as an inherently existent dictator, yeah, who's responsible for all these deaths. Yeah. Isn't that different than if you, when he was 3 years old, and you looked and you said, there's Joseph Stalin? Yeah. The same label applies to both of them. Yeah. One, we're seeing an inherently existent Joseph Stalin that corresponds with our image that we have of him. And the other one, we're just seeing some child who's given a certain name.
That was my question. So is that related, how we perceive things is related to how we feel about them?
Yeah. If we perceive things as inherently existent, then we're going to either exaggerate their good qualities and perceive them as being better than they are, or we're going to exaggerate their negative qualities and see them as being worse than they are. Okay? And then that's going to have some emotional response. Yeah? This person I just met is just fantastic. I want to be with them always. Versus, this person is just can't do anything right, such an idiot, get them away from me. And that all is reliant upon the exaggeration that we're doing, which is dependent on our perceiving them as inherently existent. Okay? Which would be one way of apprehending those three things, that thing. If you apprehended it as, here's Joseph Stalin, the 3-year-old, yeah, then you don't have any of that. There's no grasping an inherent existence at that point. Or the same thing with, your husband, okay? Yeah, so before you knew him, if you saw a picture of that guy and somebody said, there's Bruce, you would say, oh, Bruce. Okay, then you met him. Then it's, oh, Bruce. Okay? So there's a difference between just the third way and the first way. And then if you see him as empty of inherent existence, then, completely different way of relating also. Mm-hmm.
Is this a matter of degrees? Because it's really hard for me to envision something that there's absolutely no grasping. Like, objects appear inherently existent. That's an inherently existent cup. That's an inherently existent apple. But there's always at least a little bit of, that's a really pretty cup.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the nicest shade of green.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine the appearance of inherent existence without any grasping at all.
Yes, it is. It is. And because our minds so easily start to grasp.
Mm-hmm.
So easily. Yeah. So it is. It starts out subtle, but there it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And is it accurate to think that that at any time we label it mind, we're already grasping?
Oh, yeah.
It's really mild.
No.
I can identify that as maybe my Kleenex or
I'll identify it as your Kleenex. There's a dirty tissue under a dingwa. I know whose Kleenex it is. So, the same thing. We can just say mine in a way without grasping, but very easily, as soon as we say mine, grasping comes in. Okay, but like that example I give about my seat on the airplane, that's my seat. When I no longer want it, that's my seat. But when I want it, that's my seat. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Could you explain the difference between conceptual understanding of emptiness and non-conceptual?
Okay, so the difference between conceptual and non-conceptual understanding of emptiness. Conceptual means that you're perceiving it through a filter. Yeah, the filter of a concept. Whereas direct realization means that there's not that filter of any kind of conceptual appearance. It's just quite direct, the perception. Among conceptual consciousnesses apprehending emptiness, there's different kinds. Okay? So there may be one kind where we just know the name emptiness. Yeah. Oh, things, their nature is empty of inherent existence. We have no idea what it means, but we know how to associate that sound with some kind of meaning that sounds good. And we can impress people. Okay? And then maybe some time goes on and we hear teachings and we get some rough understanding of emptiness, so that's conceptual also. Then we continue learning, then we get a correct conceptual consciousness that knows emptiness. Not just some kind of rough thing that is like, not sure, but it's correct. But you still lack the certitude about it. Then you keep meditating, you keep thinking about it, studying and so forth. And then you get a correct inference. Yeah. And a correct inference that realizes emptiness can be very, very powerful. Yeah. And then if you combine that correct inference with deep samadhi, with deep concentration, then it becomes even more powerful. So there's many different gradations of conceptual consciousness, but they all share the same quality of perceiving emptiness through the veil of a conceptual appearance. They're not able to get at it directly. Okay. Takes a long time to get at it directly.
went into this direction too. So actually you are doing a lot of analytical meditation. There's not a big sense to have a concentrated meditation on emptiness, trying to, you have to analyze before you are really able to concentrate on it, right?
Yeah, you do the analysis and the concentration in different sessions, okay? Because eventually you have to, combine them. But when you're analyzing, the way the mind is working isn't going to lead you to single-pointedness at that time, when you're beginning the analysis. Yeah, but you also need to create single-pointedness and then eventually bring the two together. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Just have a question. So I was thinking about when we say stuff like there's the seeds of anger always, they're on the mind stream, but they're not manifest at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking about that and kind of thinking of the ignorance. So could we say that ignorance is always manifesting in the mind?
No, it's not always manifesting. Ignorance is not always manifesting because we see with these three ways of apprehending, that if you see things as empty, the ignorance isn't manifesting. And if you see things as neither inherently existent nor empty, then also you still have the appearance, but the ignorance isn't manifest at that point. Yeah?
I'm going to have a super left field here. With the need for intense focus and analytics over time.
Could you speak a little louder?
Intense focus and analytics over time.
Mm-hmm.
The guys that were hanging with Love Around Us and T. Ray and those guys,
Mm-hmm.
And some of their claims, we have achieved consciousness beyond conceptual. Would it be correct?
I can't talk about anybody else's level of realization.
I didn't know if that was like...
That's not an object of my perception.
I mean, to be able to talk about conceptual consciousness and say there is something beyond conceptual consciousness would indicate an understanding of what that would be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Some kind of conceptual idea of what it would be.
Okay. So, with that, I'm not saying you in particular, but a lot of people contributed to, this knowledge base. Did that come up all wholly or a possibility or?
I don't understand the question exactly.
There are claims back in the 50s and 60s. Some of the guys that came out of Harvard
Mm-hmm.
that were some experimenting.
Yeah. Oh, so are you asking if people claim to have?
I know they claim.
Yeah, but how real are their claims? How accurate are their claims?
I guess in the viewpoint of folks that have been working on this for a long
Mm-hmm.
time, and their description and experience of it that we've got recorded for 2,500 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, then you could compare, the description that the Buddha gives with the description that other people give. Yeah, you can compare that somewhat. But it's also hard to know because sometimes people use different words and mean different things by different words. Yeah. But in any case, what the guys in Harvard realized when they were dropping acid, it doesn't really matter to us. Yeah?
It's not like, Bob around us went on to become Bob around us. Some of them,
Yeah.
are expressing now through the same kinds of terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very hard you can't really know because, somebody can learn all the terms correctly and give a whole talk, like me, and it sounds really good, and I have no understanding of it. Okay, so you can't, being able to say the words and having a direct experience are two different ballgames. Huh? Mm-hmm. Last question?
I have a question. I realize I'm getting a little clear on something, but I have a question between, these three ways of seeing things are on a mental level.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how, when we talk about the sense consciousnesses, the inherent existence of appears to them.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the relationship between that and, like, say, when somebody, and this, I guess. Because
Okay.
I was thinking when somebody got a cushion, I was always thinking, and things still appear inherently exist in them, and I always think of that, I think in terms of sense consciousness, but it's not, it's also mental consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then, so what is the relationship between those?
Yeah. Well, the sense consciousnesses, things appear inherently existent to them, but they don't grasp at inherent existence. Grasping at inherent existence is only done by mental consciousness.
Which is why the whole conceptual side of it is where the freedom lies.
Yeah. Well, why you start with conception and then go to direct perception. Yeah.
So where is compassion born from?
Where does compassion come from? And in what way?
Like, what would be the dependent arising?
Of compassion? Seeing seeing sentient beings suffer, remembering their kindness to us, seeing that they're exactly like us and wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, understanding that their suffering can be removed. You know, there's so many different factors that you contemplate, and when you do, they become the cause through which you generate compassion. Okay? Compassion just doesn't come, without causes. It comes through causes, through cultivation.